Greetings, my fellow Americans, and welcome to the New Year's Eve edition of the Great Montana Conspiracy Podcast. Now, as you all know, if you've been watching these for any length of time, these actually air on Tuesdays and Saturdays, but of course, I record them the day before. So in this particular instance, I'm recording it on December 31st, 2021, and it will air on January 1st, 2022. So technically, as I'm recording this, it is New Year's Eve. And considering the date, I just feel I would be remiss if I didn't talk about families. Mainly because this particular date is possibly the hardest I deal with all year long. Now, it's not because of the celebrations, it's not because of everything else. It's because of family. And I'll explain that in a few minutes. But before we go on, remember, if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe and share the video. The more people that see this video, the more people that share it themselves, the more followers we get, the broader reach we get, the more opportunities we get to start getting this message, and the message is contained in all of these podcasts out there to the general public. As always, please consult the text attached to this video for any information on how to support us directly. But in the meantime, just like and subscribe, and I'll get more into that at the end of the message, at the end of this podcast. As I said, tonight is on the subject of families, specifically how the criminal justice system, or the so-called criminal justice system, actually affects families. And before I go into that, I just want to explain why this day is so hard for me. Today happens to be the date of my son's birthday. He was born on December 31st, 1990. And yeah, there was a lot of jokes going around that we deliberately had him on the last day of the year so we could take advantage of the tax break. It just happened to be the way it was. But my son John, I raised for the first 13 years of his life. I raised from the time he was a baby, as a single father. For the first 5 years, his mom was in the household, though largely absent. She had her own life, and I was the one who was largely staying home to take care of John. When he was 5 years old, I brought him to Kansas to be closer to my family, which was a disaster, because it didn't really work out the way I planned. It ended up getting stuck in Montana, and as circumstances evolved, and as anybody who's followed this podcast or my history understands, up through 2004, it just collapsed entirely. When I was arrested on February 20th, 2004, John stayed with some people who were my neighbors for about a week before his mom could come and get him from California. And as a reminder, we were arrested in Washington. That's the one credit I give to Sky, his mom. She didn't want him to be in the foster care system. I didn't want to be in the foster care system. So she stepped up and she did, at the time, what I thought was the best thing for John. Unfortunately, in hindsight, it wasn't. And that's because of parental alienation. From the time that we moved to Montana from California, John had a practically non-existent relationship with his mother. What conversations they had 90% of the time were because I called her and put her on the phone with him. She made so many promises to him she never kept. Promises to visit, promises to come see him, allow him come to see her. I mean, even holiday gifts were off the mark. There was one year that she didn't send Christmas gifts until April, just in time for Easter. She finally sent him his Christmas gifts. There was one year that comes to mind that he lost a Game Boy, and it was a big deal to him because it was a limited edition Pikachu Game Boy, and he was big into Pokemon. And at the time, I didn't have, they cost like about $200 a piece, $160 or something like that. But I wasn't going to be able to replace the Pikachu edition, but I could replace with a bundle that had the Game Boy and a Pokemon game, and John wanted that. And I could come with about $100 of it. And we called up Sky to ask her if she could help with the other $60 or $80 or whatever it was. And this was around August. And she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I can't help you because we've already spent all of our money on his Christmas presents. and we have to return his Christmas presents to be able to help. It was really early August for Christmas, but okay. So my soon-to-be girlfriend, she wasn't my girlfriend at that point in time yet, Mara did step up and let John do some work out at her place to get the money he needed to buy the Game Boy. So the Game Boy was bought. He got his Game Boy, no thanks to his mother at all. Christmas rolled around that year, and we were expecting, he's got a big, nice, beautiful present coming this year. It was one year the Christmas presents actually arrived relatively on time. As I recall, they arrived a few days after Christmas. It was a box full of all of her used PlayStation 2 games. The ones that she had already played, was done with, and sent to him. And an old PlayStation 1. I had to buy the adapter for the TV because she didn't even bother to send that. Everything she sent, everything was used that she had used, was done with, and sent on to her son for Christmas. Now, mind you, John loved it. John absolutely loved it because it was PlayStation 2. It was a PlayStation. Unfortunately, and I never raised it with John. I never brought it up to him. But it just burned me in the craw that her big excuse for not helping him buy that Game Boy was that she had already bought his Christmas. She spent money on herself. This was the level of involvement and emotional commitment she had to having a child. So when she stepped forward and offered to take John under the circumstances, I was grateful. But then she proceeded to alienate him from me. When I was first arrested, I was allowed to talk to him. Allowed to talk to him a couple times a week. Then it was talk to him a couple times a month. As it was getting more expensive, and believe me, I can believe it was getting expensive because those at the time, we weren't able to buy phone cards. We had to call the person collect, and therefore the collect calls were atrociously expensive. So it went down to a couple times a month to once a month until finally Sky gets on the phone with me and says, every time you call, he breaks down in tears and he's emotionally upset. You need to stop calling because it's really emotionally bad for him to be able to talk to you. So I agreed to just write letters. I figured the letters were a better interpretation. Little did I know that this was because Sky, it had nothing to do with John being upset. It had everything to do with the fact that talking to me counterbalanced whatever she was telling him. If she was telling him I didn't care about him, here I was telling him I loved him and cared about him and reminded him of the emotional bond we had. Never once got a response to the letters I sent. I sent them over and over and over again, right up until the time I went to prison. Even after I got to prison, I sent letters. In 2007, I finally got one letter from John. It was a hate-filled letter, just attacking me, vile in the things he was saying. He said he knew I had tried to kill him, which I never have to this day figured out what he's talking about. All I know is that his mother filled his head with hate for me, and his hate that persisted throughout the rest of his adolescence and into his adulthood. And I've never had the chance to speak to him to find out what she told him to counteract whatever she might have said, that whatever lies she's told him about me. However she got him to turn away from me was successful. And the problem is, John had an alienation from his mother, of her choosing. She alienated herself from him. He was so desperate for her approval. So desperate. He would have done anything to get her approval, to get her love, to get her affection. And I don't think Sky would have had to try all that hard to try to convince him that this is what you had to do to get my love. Hate your dad. Hate him, vilify him, cut him off. Whatever she told him, I'll never know, likely. He turns 31 today. And now, as of, in February, I'll have not seen him in over 18 years. At this point, it's almost 18 years, but I haven't had any real constructive communication with him. I'm not alone in how this affects families, though. Parental alienation, although a very serious aspect of this, is not the only issue. when it comes to the overcriminalization of America and how it impacts families. Sometimes the family members are called the hidden victims of crime because, in a nutshell, they're the ones who are affected and impacted by everything that happens, but they're never really paid attention to. They aren't, compensated out of a victims' compensation fund. They aren't given any kind of assistance from the state to support the absence of that parent from the household. They aren't given anything, no counseling, nothing. As a consequence, they're just basically left hanging in the wind, victimized by the criminal justice system because one person of the family, possibly the breadwinner, since like 80% of the incarcerated state in the country are men, and maybe 70%. Actually, don't quote me on that's not an actual statistic. It's just various different statistics rattling around in my head. I don't have that one right in front of me, so don't hold me to that. But it's a very much larger percentage of men incarcerated than women. Men are often the breadwinners of the household when you still have a nuclear dynamic of a family. And even when the father is absent, he's still paying child support. Unless he's in prison, in which case he's not paying child support. Not paying anything to support his family. His family has to fend on their own. President Obama in 2016 was mounting a campaign against the criminal justice system. Keep in mind, at this point in time, it's still 2021. It'll be 2022 in just a few hours. But in 2016, President Obama was talking about how the criminal justice was plagued by overaggressive policing, prison overcrowding, and abominable conditions for the inmates. All absolutely true. I speak from personal experience. I've lived through it. To quote him, he actually said, "An aspect of American life that remains particularly skewed by race and wealth, a source of inequality that has ripple effects on families and communities, and ultimately on our nation." And he's talking about the criminal justice system. Yet in spite of the publicity, in spite of the fact that the head of our country was touting about this back in 2016, nothing has changed. The 1980s saw Ronald Reagan calling for the war on drugs. Well, actually, it was Nancy calling for it in speeches and then Ronald backing her up, because we all know who wore the pants in that relationship. Well, anybody who observed the pair knows who was wearing the pants in that relationship. Nancy was I don't want to use an inappropriate term, speak ill of the dead, but Ronald Reagan was a great president in many respects, but his wife was very strong-leashed in that relationship. I've actually seen caricatures drawn of them showing Bill Clinton with a leash and Nancy Reagan holding it. Not exactly an inaccurate depiction, but when Ronald Reagan called for the war on drugs, it launched an already foundational element that had started in the congressional system of rewarding states for changing their laws and pushing for harsher penalties on crimes. In the 1990s, Bill Clinton just compounded upon that with his call for the war on lawlessness. All that was done by doing any of this was create the world's largest penal system. And notably, I do not say world's largest criminal justice system. That's not what this is. As I've said repeatedly in several videos before, this is not about justice. It's not even about crime in many instances. In Montana, it certainly isn't. It's about using crime as a smokescreen to get people into prison as numbers to get money from the federal government. The more people are in prison, the more money they get from the federal government. It's a tit for tat. In 1970, there were around 340,000 Americans incarcerated. Today, there are approximately 2.3 million. By 2000, over 2 million children had incarcerated fathers. That is untenable in any kind of civilized society. And yet, America, land of the free, home of the brave, supposedly the beachhead for democracy in the world, is the most ferocious, I'm not even sure if that's a word, the most horrific example of throwing people in prison just to throw them in prison to demonstrate the power of the government. It is not a democratic system. It is a system of tyranny. I've spoken quite a bit about the overcriminalization of America's justice system to this point. I've spoken about the effects on people and how they're incarcerated, but I just haven't spoken about how it affects families and the collateral damage that happens to families as a consequence of this system. And considering my own experience with my loss of family, it just seemed like this was the appropriate day to do it. And to be honest, I really don't have the spirit to be doing this today. All I want to do is just be depressed. I've been depressed most of the day. All I can think about is my son. All I can think about is what I don't have. Add that to all the limitations I have. I can't go to parties, in bars, casinos. I can't publicly go out and celebrate the holiday. So I'm pretty much stuck at home. I have my cats and a whole bunch of fireworks going off outside. Speaking of which, one of my cats is over here on the side trying to get attention. Felicia's trying to get over here on the screen. If she does get on the screen, I do apologize. If you can see my arm moving over here to the left, it's me trying to keep her at bay. But she slips by. She has before. But anyway, I've spoken to quite a bit of people through the years. I mean, I've been inside the prison. I've been through programs. I've been to the probation department. I've spoken with a lot of people who've been deprived access to their children. So this is not just me personally. This is not just, hey, let's just go ahead and attack Ron. This is something we can do in addition to what's already been done to him as a political prisoner. These are actually conditions that affect everybody who's in the incarcerated. Just about. Anybody who doesn't, maybe there might be a small percentage of people in the system who don't have any kind of family whatsoever. But most people do. Some kind of family, whether it be parents, children, spouse, cousins, aunts, whatever. Studies have shown that children, and children by far are not the only ones affected by this, but children alone suffer a plethora of problems. They suffer psychological strain, the stigma of having a father in prison or in jail. The antisocial behavior starts being demonstrated as they start lashing out. It leads to suspension or expulsion from school in many cases. Economic hardships impact the family. It eventually leads to criminal activity in many, many instances. More criminal activity than would otherwise be present if the parent was not absent and in jail. Nuclear families suffer as a result. Nuclear families are the idea of a mother, a father, and children having whether it be married or whatever, both parents are in the home, the children are being raised by both parents. But when one parent is absent, you lose loss of family income, and as I've mentioned, most of the time that's the man. And men, by far, whether it's fair, equal, I'm not even going to begin going down that road. It's not equal, it's not fair, and I'm not in any way endorsing it, but the fact is, men statistically earn more money in American society than women. Men are often the breadwinners. Women often are the ones who are relegated to staying home to take care of their children when they can. Anymore, with rates of inflation since the 70s, even that's diminished as the mother is forced to return to work to try to help support the household. But with a loss of family income, there's also no child support for fathers who are absent, or mothers who are absent for that matter. No health insurance coming from the absent parent. No state safety net to exist to help compensate for the absence of that parent in the family. Families break apart. They don't last through this. There was a 2014 study by criminologists Sonia Sinek, Eric Stalwart, and Jeremy Staff that showed that incarceration leads to divorce more frequently. The study shows a persistent increase of divorce likelihood by 32% per year of incarceration. Even brief arrests can be the impetus for divorce, as the stigma of having someone who's been arrested impacts the family, whether it be because it affects the ability for that individual to return to work, or whether it affects the social standing in the individuals. It causes stress within the family unit, and divorces are therefore more frequent. The study shows that it's not just separation, and separation is a big factor, a huge factor when it comes to marriage. But the stigma of being married to a convict or being married to somebody who's been in the system or who's presently in the system has a significant impact upon the individual, especially if they're alone and they're left alone to deal with this stress on their own without any kind of backup, support, counseling, anything. They have to pay exorbitant amounts to communicate with their loved ones. They don't have physical contact with their loved ones. They don't have any degree of intimacy. It's all gone. Devastated by this system. And remember, as I pointed out significantly in the past, there's usually an extended period of pre-trial incarceration, which means before they're ever tried, before they ever get convicted, before they ever get actual sentence for a crime, they're locked up anywhere between 3 to 6 to 9, sometimes 18 months before they see a trial. As a consequence, that separation wears on family bonding. Whereas minor issues like money or how to rear the children or the neighbor's dog coming and pooping on the lawn will be normal stresses that may be ongoing in a relationship. Once that parent is absent and now incarcerated, looking at possible prison time, looking at possible life of livelihood, it creates an absolute cascading failure of a dynamic that leads to divorce, way more in incarcerated individuals' families than otherwise. Formerly incarcerated men have fewer marriages and a greater number of divorces, which means once they get out, they marry less often. And then when they do get married, they get married with even less success because the divorces just pile up. Formerly incarcerated men are twice as likely to be domestically abusive as well. Statistics show that formerly incarcerated men have about a 50% chance, greater chance, about twice as much, actually, to be abusive in relationships, or more reports of domestic abuse are by people who have been formerly incarcerated. Another aspect to look at, though not directly related, there is a common ground. It's like, okay, if this is true, this must have an impact in some way, kind of rationality. There's a common thread noticeable in family statistics. In 1970, over 80% of white women, 25 to 34, over 80% of them were married. In 2000, it was 60%. The same period, black women fell from 60% to around 30%. During the same period, the number of single-parent households rose by equal numbers. Essentially, the same period increased incarceration occurred between the 1970s and 2000, led to a systematically fewer marriages, fewer stability, more single-parent households, less stability in the nuclear family was basically dissolving. And it's hard not to draw a parallel between the two. When the same period exists and statistics breed down, and you already have statistics that support the loss of family unity, is it any wonder that as a whole, the nation's belief in marriage and stability is crumbling? Single-parent households are on the rise, and they have been since the invention of this mass incarceration system in America. Essentially, while they're still having children, they're just not part of family dynamics. And remember, many of the people incarcerated are driven there by fear of further harm, and they're not necessarily guilty. When you're an innocent person, have no understanding of the legal system, no understanding of how the system works, and you're being told by someone that, look, when you go to trial, you're going to face 10 years, but if you take this plea deal, and you just say you did it, you only face 2. We don't have much of a chance in court, but, take your risk, and you can get 2 or you can get 10. Even innocent people are terrorized at the prospect of doing 10 years for something they didn't do. Terrorized. And in that fear and that isolationism, remember, they're not surrounded by family. They can't go home and have dinner with their wife and discuss it. Most of the time, these guys are pre-trial incarceration, isolated. The only people they're surrounded by are people who oftentimes have already been inside the prison system. And they're being told, oh, you need to take the plea deal, you need to take the plea deal, you need to take the plea deal. Next thing you know, they take the plea deal even if they're not guilty. And of course, their families suffer as a consequence. Because regardless of whether they accept a lesser sentence, they're still accepting a conviction. And that conviction has massive, massive consequences. As I said, I've talked before on the subject of pretrial detention. You know my feelings on this. The impact of fear motivates towards plea bargains and even the innocent fall. I didn't take a plea bargain. I went all the way to trial and I still fell. So it's not a perfect system. And obviously, I really probably need to do another episode that's more extensive on the subject of plea bargains, because it really is an issue that I've kind of lumped in with other subjects, but it really deserves its own time in the spotlight. But time for another day. None of these statistics, of course, incorporate the parental alienation that I went through and that I've talked about at the beginning of this episode. It's very real and it's very common. Mothers at home are told their fathers are pieces of, fill in the appropriate expletive here. They are told they're worthless. They're told they don't have any business. They'll deliberately block the children from contact with the father or mother, as the case may be, while they're incarcerated. When they get out, they've oftentimes hooked up with somebody else who do not want the other person around. I personally met hundreds of men who've had their baby mamas, for lack of a better way of saying it, go to court and have ridiculous restrictions imposed upon their ability to contact their children based primarily on the fact that they were incarcerated, either presently incarcerated or after they were released. The fact that they were incarcerated is used as a stigma to prevent them from having any parental rights at all. Obviously, this affects me personally. Because of parental alienation, I lost my son. And there's no safety measure that exists to prevent this. No one reaches out to the children from the state. Nobody tries to make sure that a relationship is maintained, that the other parent isn't allowed to alienate the child or to keep the child distant. And of course, in Montana, with a higher per capita incarceration, the effects are exponentially worse. And Montana has a greater incarceration rate than literally anywhere in the world. How can social impact not be greater? Unfortunately, no one has conducted a study specific to Montana that I've been able to find. And I've looked. I've looked quite extensively. I can't find anything that specifically targets Montana with the observation of this system because nobody in Montana actually wants to acknowledge this. The only people who actually acknowledge these statistics are the ones who are not in Montana. They're the ones who are noticing it as a national standard, looking at all the states collectively and comparing the individual states. No one's actually looking at Montana, which is the biggest problem, which is where the great Montana conspiracy comes in, because Montana government does not want to be scrutinized. They go out of their way to do it. So when you don't have anybody wanting to pay attention to this, you don't have anybody who's looking into it, nobody investigating it, nobody doing reports, nobody doing studies, nobody collecting the information that needs to be collected. Corrupt officials rely upon undermining and causing division in the populace. If the populace is not unified, if the people are not gathered together, if they do not come together, they can't stand against the government. One of my many quoted things comes from Benjamin Franklin, and I've quoted this on this podcast many times before. We had best hang together, or surely we shall all hang separately. And he was speaking, of course, physically about being hung from the neck, which was the method of treason, the death penalty for treason at the time. But it holds true. If we don't stand together, if we don't hang together, we're going to be torn apart separately. And so long as the government can continue to undermine even the basic forms of unity, our family unit, how can unity ever be created? When government breaks apart family, it leads to a lack of unity. It leads to a lack of community. And unity is what is needed to stand up to corruption. When the people are forced to care for their families over standing up to corruption, what happens? Well, obviously, you're going to stand with your family. You're going to defend your family. How many times have we seen in movies and TV shows and stories where someone, their child is threatened, and they'll give in to the most atrocious demand to spare their child? Even if it costs thousands of other people's lives, they'll do anything to save their child. So when your family is threatened, and your family's unity must be attended to, you can't focus on anything else. You've got to focus on your family. And that's what the government counts on. And of course, the more divisive, the more difficult it can make it, all the better. Whether it's deliberate or whether it's something that just is a happenstance side effect that the government sits back and laughs about, I think it's probably more of the latter of the two, but nevertheless, it is something that benefits corruption and benefits the powers that be to stay in power. Well, there's my little blurb of freedom tonight. Again, if you ever like this, if you ever want to share it, please do. I mean, the more people that view this, the more people that like this, the more people that kick this to the message to other people, the better chance we have of getting our message out there, and the better chance we have of coming together. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, if you're watching this on YouTube, and I do encourage you to watch this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Also, be so kind as to share this video with your friends. Post it on Facebook, post it on whatever medium you can. Get the message out there. The more people that listen, the better chance we have of actually doing something effectively. Because without information, you don't know what you're fighting against. As always, please do be safe out there, especially tonight. It is, of course, you're not going to be watching this until tomorrow morning. So in hindsight, I hope that you will have been safe on New Year's Eve and you'll have a blessed and bountiful New Year. As I always say at the end of these videos, I do hope that you're safe, and whenever possible, please be free. Thank you.